Have you ever witnessed someone challenge authority so boldly that it literally shook the earth beneath their feet? Have you ever wondered what happens when rebellion meets divine justice head-on? Today we're diving into one of the most terrifying and shocking confrontations in all of Scripture. A story so intense that when you hear the details, you might never look at spiritual authority the same way again. The story of Korah isn't just ancient history, it's a warning that echoes through time, a divine demonstration of what happens when pride and ambition collide with God's established order. This isn't your typical Sunday school lesson, because what happened to Korah and his followers was so dramatic, so unprecedented, that it left an entire nation trembling in fear. But here's what most people don't realize about this story. Korah wasn't some random troublemaker causing problems from the outside. He wasn't a foreigner or an enemy of Israel. Korah was an insider, a Levite, someone who already held a position of honor and responsibility in God's kingdom. He had access to the holy things. He served in the tabernacle. He was chosen by God himself for sacred duties, and yet he wanted more. What drove this man to risk everything? What made him believe he could challenge Moses and Aaron, the very leaders God had appointed? And why did God's response shake the earth itself, opening up the ground to swallow rebels whole? I'm telling you right now, by the end of this journey, you're going to understand something profound about the nature of divine authority, about the deadly consequences of spiritual pride, and about why God takes challenges to his appointed leadership so seriously. You're going to see how this ancient drama connects directly to struggles we face today, how the same spirit that consumed Korah is still operating in our world, still deceiving people into believing they can improve on God's design. But before we dive into the shocking climax of this story, before we witness the earth opening up like a hungry mouth, we need to understand how we got here. We need to see the slow burn of resentment, the gradual building of opposition, the careful recruitment of followers that led to one of the most dramatic displays of divine judgment in human history. So, buckle up, because this story is going to take you on a ride you won't forget. We're going back to the wilderness, to a time when the presence of God dwelt among his people in visible glory, when miracles were daily occurrences, and when challenging God's anointed could literally cost you your life. The stage is set in the wilderness of Paran, somewhere in the vast expanses between Egypt and the Promised Land. The children of Israel have been wandering for months now, following the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night. They've witnessed incredible miracles. They've been fed by manna from heaven. They've seen water flow from rocks and enemies defeated by divine intervention. But something is stirring in the camp, something dark and dangerous. Discontent is spreading like poison through the tribes. Whispered conversations are happening in tents after dark. And at the center of it all is a man whose name would become synonymous with rebellion itself. Korah, son of Izhar, grandson of Kohath, great-grandson of Levi. His genealogy reads like a spiritual resume, each name carrying weight and significance in the unfolding story of God's people. The Levites were the chosen tribe, set apart for service to the Lord, given the privilege of caring for the tabernacle and assisting in worship. Within the Levites, the Kohathites held a place of special honor, responsible for the most sacred objects, the Ark of the Covenant, the golden altar, the table of showbread. Korah wasn't struggling at the bottom of society's ladder. He wasn't a nobody fighting for recognition. He was already somebody, already blessed, already chosen for sacred service. But apparently, being somebody wasn't enough. He wanted to be the somebody. Picture this scene if you can. Every morning, Korah would wake up in his tent, look across the camp, and see the tabernacle in the center, surrounded by the tents of Aaron and his sons. Every day, he would perform his duties, handling the sacred vessels, participating in worship, serving in the presence of the Almighty. And every day, Something inside him burned with increasing intensity. Why should Aaron be the high priest? What made him so special? They were all descendants of Levi. They all had access to God. They all served in holy things. But Aaron got to enter the Holy of Holies. Aaron got to wear the sacred garments. Aaron got to make atonement for the people. Aaron's sons would inherit the priesthood, carrying on a dynasty that seemed to push everyone else into secondary roles. And Moses, don't even get started on Moses. Sure, he had led them out of Egypt. Sure, he had worked miracles and received the law. But who made him the final authority on everything? Who decided he got to speak for God while everyone else had to listen and obey? These thoughts didn't develop overnight. Rebellion rarely does. It starts as a whisper, a small complaint, a tiny seed of dissatisfaction that finds fertile ground in pride and ambition. Day by day, week by week, month by month, that seed grows, sending out roots, developing branches, until it becomes a tree that blocks out the light of truth and humility. Korah began to watch Aaron more carefully, looking for flaws, searching for evidence that he wasn't as qualified as he appeared. He started paying attention to Moses' decisions, questioning his motives, wondering if there might be better ways to lead. He began having conversations with other Levites, carefully testing the waters, seeing who else might be feeling overlooked or underappreciated. What he discovered was that he wasn't alone in his frustration. There were others who felt the current system wasn't fair, others who believed they deserved more recognition, more authority, more access to the presence of God. Slowly, carefully, a network of discontent began to form. But Korah was smart about his rebellion. He didn't just gather a handful of disgruntled Levites and march on Moses' tent. He understood that successful revolutions need broad support. They need to appear legitimate. They need to convince people that change isn't just desired but necessary. So he reached beyond his own tribe. He connected with Dathan and Abiram, sons of Eliab from the tribe of Reuben. These men had their own grievances against Moses. They remembered that Reuben was Jacob's firstborn son, which should have given their tribe certain privileges and leadership roles. Instead, they found themselves following Moses, a man from Levi, while their tribal birthright seemed to count for nothing. The alliance made perfect sense. Korah brought religious authority and sacred standing to the rebellion. Dathan and Abiram brought tribal politics and the claim of birthright. Together, they could present their challenge as both spiritually motivated and historically justified. But they needed more than just tribal leaders. They needed the people, the masses who would validate their cause and make their movement appear to be the voice of the community, rather than just ambitious individuals seeking power. So they carefully recruited, building their coalition one person at a time. The text tells us they gathered 250 men, leaders of the congregation, chosen in the assembly, men of renown. These weren't random troublemakers or outcasts looking for attention. These were established figures, people with influence and standing in the community. When men like this joined a movement, it gave that movement credibility and momentum. Can you imagine the conversations that must have taken place as this conspiracy developed? Picture Korah meeting with potential supporters, carefully presenting his case, painting a vision of a more democratic, more inclusive approach to leadership and worship. Why should only Aaron's family serve as priests? He might have argued. Are we not all holy? Did God not choose all of Israel as a kingdom of priests? Why should we be satisfied with secondary roles when we could all draw near to the Lord? It's important to understand that Korah's arguments weren't obviously wrong on the surface. In fact, they contained elements of truth that made them particularly seductive. God had indeed called all Israel to be a holy nation, a kingdom of priests. The people were all chosen, all set apart, all precious in God's sight. But truth twisted becomes deception, and partial truth can be more dangerous than outright lies. Korah took legitimate spiritual concepts and used them to justify illegitimate spiritual ambition. He took God's love for all his people and twisted it into an argument against God's appointed structure for his people. This is always how spiritual rebellion works. It doesn't present itself as opposition to God, but as a better understanding of God's will. It doesn't claim to reject divine authority, but to represent it more fairly, more inclusively, more authentically. As the conspiracy grew, so did the boldness of its participants. What started as private conversations became public criticism. What began as subtle questions about leadership decisions became open challenges to Moses' authority. The atmosphere in the camp began to change, charged with tension and expectation. Moses, of course, was aware of what was happening. You can't organize 250 leaders in a rebellion without word getting back to the target of that rebellion. But Moses' response reveals something crucial about his character and his relationship with God. He didn't panic. He didn't launch a preemptive strike. He didn't try to outmaneuver his opponents politically. Instead, Moses did what he always did when faced with challenges beyond his ability to handle. He fell on his face before the Lord. He took the matter to the ultimate authority, the one who had appointed him in the first place, the one who could vindicate his calling or remove it as he saw fit. This brings us to a critical moment in the narrative, because God's response to Moses' prayer is going to set in motion events that will shake the entire nation and establish principles about spiritual authority that echo through Scripture and into our own time. But before we see heaven's answer to earth's rebellion, we need to understand what was really at stake in this confrontation. This wasn't just about Moses versus Korah, or Aaron versus ambitious Levites, or even about competing visions of leadership structure. This was about something far more fundamental and far more dangerous. This was about the very nature of divine authority, about who gets to decide how God's people should be organized and led, about whether human wisdom can improve on divine design. Korah and his followers believed they had a better idea. They looked at God's system and decided it was too restrictive, too hierarchical, too exclusive. They wanted something more democratic, more egalitarian, more in line with their own sense of what was fair and right. What they failed to understand was that they weren't just challenging human leadership. They were challenging the God who had established that leadership. They weren't just questioning Moses and Aaron. They were questioning the divine wisdom that had chosen Moses and Aaron. This is the pattern we see throughout Scripture and throughout history. Rebellion against God rarely presents itself as direct opposition to the Almighty. Instead, it disguises itself as reform, as progress, as a more enlightened understanding of God's true intentions. The stage was now set for one of the most dramatic confrontations in biblical history. On one side stood the established order, Moses and Aaron, backed by divine appointment and confirmed by miraculous signs. On the other side stood the revolutionaries, Korah and his coalition, armed with compelling arguments and popular support. The tension in the camp must have been unbearable. Every conversation carried potential danger. Every gathering might be the spark that ignited open conflict. Families were divided, loyalties were tested, and the very foundations of Israel's social and spiritual structure hung in the balance. What happened next would determine not just the immediate fate of the rebellion, but the future direction of God's people. Would divine authority prevail, or would human ambition triumph? Would God's appointed leaders be vindicated, or would they be overthrown by a popular movement claiming to represent the will of the people? The answer was coming, and when it arrived, it would be more shocking, more decisive, and more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. But God wasn't going to let this challenge linger in uncertainty. The Lord spoke to Moses with crystal clarity, and his instructions revealed something profound about how heaven handles rebellion. This wasn't going to be settled through debate or negotiation or political maneuvering. This was going to be settled through divine demonstration. Listen to what God told Moses to do. He was to gather the entire congregation the next morning and have Korah and his followers bring censers, those sacred vessels used for offering incense before the Lord. Each man would put fire in his censer, place incense upon it, and present himself before the tabernacle. Then God himself would make it clear who was holy and who was chosen to draw near to him. Can you feel the weight of what was about to happen? This wasn't just a test of leadership qualifications or a vote of confidence. This was a direct appeal to heaven itself, a moment when the invisible God would make his will visible to every person in the camp. Moses understood exactly what this meant. When he announced God's plan to the people, his words carried both invitation and warning. "Tomorrow morning," he declared, "the Lord will show who belongs to him and who is holy, and he will have that person come near to him. The man he chooses he will cause to come near to him." But then Moses did something that reveals the heart of a true leader. Even though Korah had challenged him publicly, even though this rebellion threatened everything he had worked to build, Moses made one final attempt to reason with his opponents. He called specifically to the Levites, trying to help them understand what they were really doing. "Isn't it enough for you," Moses asked them, "that the God of Israel has separated you from the rest of the Israelite community and brought you near himself to do the work at the Lord's tabernacle and to stand before the community and minister to them? He has brought you and all your fellow Levites near himself, but now you are trying to get the priesthood too." These words cut straight to the heart of the matter. Moses wasn't defending his own position or protecting his own power. He was trying to help these men see that they were despising the very blessings God had already given them. They had been chosen from among all Israel for sacred service. They had been brought near to the presence of the Almighty. They had been given roles of honor and responsibility that millions of people would never experience. But it wasn't enough. They wanted more. They wanted what belonged to Aaron. They wanted to push past the boundaries God had established and claim privileges that hadn't been granted to them. This is one of the most dangerous traps that spiritual pride can set. It causes us to look at what we don't have instead of treasuring what we do have. It makes us covet positions that God hasn't given us while neglecting the calling he has placed on our lives. It turns blessing into bitterness and privilege into poison. Moses tried to help them see this, but his words fell on deaf ears. The rebellion had gone too far. The conspirators had invested too much, and pride had hardened their hearts beyond the reach of reason. When Moses sent for Dathan and Abiram to come and hear God's plan for settling the dispute, their response revealed just how far the rebellion had progressed. They refused to come. Not only did they refuse, but they sent back a message that was dripping with contempt and accusation. "We will not come up," they declared through their messengers. "Is it not enough that you have brought us up out of a land that flows with milk and honey to kill us in the desert? And now you also want to lord it over us? Moreover, you haven't brought us into a land flowing with milk and honey, or given us an inheritance of fields and vineyards. Will you gouge out the eyes of these men? We will not come up." The audacity of this response is breathtaking. They called Egypt the land of their slavery, a place flowing with milk and honey. They accused Moses of plotting their deaths in the wilderness. They painted him as a power-hungry dictator who was trying to blind people to the truth of his failures. This wasn't just rebellion anymore. This was character assassination. This was a complete rewriting of history designed to make Moses look like the villain and themselves look like the victims. They were trying to convince people that slavery in Egypt was better than freedom in the wilderness, that bondage under Pharaoh was preferable to following the God who had delivered them with mighty signs and wonders. When Moses heard this response, Scripture tells us that he became very angry. This wasn't petty irritation or wounded pride. This was righteous indignation at seeing God's goodness twisted into accusations of evil, at watching divine mercy portrayed as cruel manipulation. Moses took his anger straight to the Lord. "Do not accept their offering," he prayed. "I have not taken so much as a donkey from them, nor have I wronged any of them." This wasn't a leader trying to protect his reputation. This was a servant appealing to the God who knew his heart and could testify to his integrity. The next morning arrived with an atmosphere you could cut with a knife. Word had spread throughout the entire camp about what was going to happen. This wasn't going to be a private meeting between leaders. This was going to be a public demonstration before the eyes of every man, woman, and child in Israel. Picture the scene as the sun rose over the wilderness camp. Hundreds of thousands of people were stirring in their tents, preparing for a day that everyone knew would be unlike any other. Children were asking their parents what was going to happen. Elders were shaking their heads, remembering other times when people had challenged God's authority and paid terrible prices. At the appointed time, Korah and his 250 supporters gathered at the entrance to the tabernacle. Each man carried his censer, filled with fire and incense, ready to present his offering before the Lord. They came with confidence, believing that God would vindicate their cause and expose the unfairness of the current system. But they weren't alone. Moses had called for the entire congregation to assemble, and now hundreds of thousands of people were gathering around the tabernacle, forming a vast crowd that stretched as far as the eye could see. Everyone wanted to witness this moment when heaven would speak and the truth would finally be revealed. The tension was unbearable. On one side stood Moses and Aaron, the established leaders, waiting to see if God would continue to support their authority. On the other side stood Korah and his coalition, confident that their cause was just and that God would recognize the validity of their complaints. But something was about to happen that none of them expected. God wasn't just going to choose between competing groups of leaders. He wasn't just going to settle a dispute about who should serve as priests. He was about to demonstrate something far more profound and far more terrifying about the nature of divine authority and the consequences of challenging it. As the crowd gathered and the morning sun climbed higher in the desert sky, the presence of the Lord began to manifest in ways that made everyone fall silent. This wasn't going to be a debate or a discussion. This wasn't going to be resolved through human reasoning or democratic process. This was going to be settled by the God who sees all hearts, who knows all motives, who cannot be deceived by clever arguments or swayed by popular opinion. And his judgment was going to be so decisive, so final, and so shocking that it would echo through the rest of Scripture as a warning to anyone who might consider following in Korah's footsteps. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic displays of divine justice in human history. The players were in position, the crowd was assembled, and heaven was about to speak in a voice that would shake the earth itself. What happened next would change everything. It would vindicate God's chosen leaders, expose the deadly nature of spiritual pride, and establish principles about divine authority that would guide God's people for generations to come. But it would also reveal something about the heart of God that many people struggle to accept. Something about his holiness and justice that makes even his mercy more precious. The moment of truth had arrived, and neither Korah nor anyone else in that vast assembly was prepared for what God was about to do. The silence that fell over the camp was unlike anything they had ever experienced. Not the quiet of sleep or the hush of prayer, but the terrible stillness that comes when heaven itself is about to speak. Every breath seemed amplified, every heartbeat echoed like thunder, and the very air itself seemed to tremble with anticipation. Moses stood before the tabernacle, his face reflecting decades of walking with God, of witnessing miracles that defied human understanding, of carrying burdens that would have crushed lesser men. But there was something different about him now. Something that made even his closest supporters step back and give him space. He had heard from the Lord. When Moses spoke, his voice carried across the vast assembly with supernatural clarity. Every word reached the ears of every person, from the smallest child clinging to their mother's robes to the eldest patriarch leaning on his walking stick. This wasn't just a man speaking. This was a prophet delivering a message that would determine the fate of nations. "This is how you will know that the Lord has sent me to do all these things," Moses declared, his words cutting through the morning air like a blade. "It was not my idea. If these men die a natural death, if they experience only what usually happens to men, then the Lord has not sent me." The crowd stirred uneasily. What was he saying? What kind of test was this? But Moses wasn't finished. His next words would hang in the air like a sword suspended over every head in the assembly. "But if the Lord brings about something totally new, if the ground opens its mouth and swallows them, with everything that belongs to them, and they go down alive into the grave, then you will know that these men have treated the Lord with contempt." A collective gasp rose from the people. The ground opening up? Swallowing people alive? This wasn't just a leadership dispute anymore. This was about forces beyond human comprehension, about divine power that could reshape the very earth beneath their feet. Korah and his followers stood frozen, their senses still in their hands, the confidence that had carried them to this moment beginning to crack like ice under pressure. They had expected vindication, they had anticipated triumph, but these words spoke of something far more terrible than they had ever imagined. And then Moses did something that revealed the heart of true spiritual authority. Even in this moment of ultimate confrontation, even knowing what God was about to do, he showed mercy one final time. "Move away from the tents of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram," he called out to the crowd. "Do not touch anything belonging to them, or you will be swept away because of all their sins." This wasn't cruelty. This was compassion. Moses was trying to protect innocent people from being caught up in the judgment that was about to fall. He was giving families a chance to separate themselves from the rebellion, offering safety to anyone wise enough to distance themselves from what was coming. The response was immediate and terrifying. People began backing away from the area around Korah's tent, parents grabbing their children, elderly couples helping each other move to safer ground. The urgency in Moses' voice had communicated something that went beyond words. This was a matter of life and death, and everyone could feel it. But not everyone moved. Some remained close to the rebel leaders, whether out of loyalty or defiance or simple disbelief that anything supernatural could really happen. They would soon learn that proximity to rebellion is proximity to judgment, that standing with those who challenge God's authority means sharing in their fate. Dathan and Abiram emerged from their tents with their families, their faces set in stubborn determination. Even now, even with Moses' warning ringing in their ears, they refused to back down. They stood in their doorways, like sentries guarding their positions, as if their defiance could somehow shield them from divine judgment. The atmosphere became electric, charged with the kind of tension that makes the hair on your arms stand up and your heart race without explanation. Animals began acting strangely, sensing something their human masters couldn't yet perceive. Dogs whimpered and pressed close to their owners. Livestock grew restless and agitated. Even the birds seemed to flee the area as if driven by instincts older than reason. And then Moses spoke again, but this time his words weren't directed at the people. This time he was speaking directly to the God who had called him from a burning bush, who had sent him to Pharaoh with signs and wonders, who had parted the Red Sea and given the law at Sinai. "O God, the God of the spirits of all flesh," Moses prayed, his voice carrying the weight of intercession that only comes from years of standing between heaven and earth. "When one man sins, will you be angry with the entire assembly?" Even in this moment of ultimate crisis, Moses was thinking about the people. Even knowing that judgment was necessary, he was concerned about protecting the innocent. This is what true leadership looks like, not grasping for power or defending personal position, but standing in the gap and pleading for mercy even toward those who don't deserve it. God's response came swift and clear, cutting through Moses' prayer, with instructions that revealed both justice and mercy in perfect balance. "Tell the assembly to move away from the tents of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram." The message was unmistakable. Judgment was coming, but salvation was still available to anyone willing to separate themselves from the rebellion. God's wrath was about to be revealed, but his mercy was creating a path of escape for all who would take it. Moses delivered the message with urgency that communicated far more than his words alone. Get away from the tents of these wicked men. Do not touch anything belonging to them, or you will be swept away because of all their sins. The word wicked hung in the air like thunder. This wasn't political opposition or honest disagreement about leadership styles. This was wickedness, rebellion against the holy God who had chosen and appointed his servants. This was sin that demanded judgment, evil that could not be tolerated without consequences. The crowd surged backward like water flowing away from a breach in a dam. Hundreds, then thousands of people began moving away from the area around the rebel leaders, creating an ever-widening circle of empty ground. Mothers clutched their babies, fathers guided their families to safety, and the elderly were helped by younger relatives who understood that this was no time for pride or stubbornness. But in the center of that growing circle stood Korah, Dathan, Abiram, and their families. Isolated now, exposed and alone, they faced a choice that would determine their eternal destiny. They could humble themselves, admit their error, and throw themselves on God's mercy. Or they could maintain their rebellion to the bitter end. The choice they made would echo through Scripture as a warning to every generation that would follow. As the last of the crowd moved to what they hoped was a safe distance, an eerie quiet settled over the camp once again. It was the kind of silence that comes before storms, before earthquakes, before moments when the natural order of things is about to be shattered by forces beyond human control. Moses stood at the edge of the circle, looking across that empty space toward the men who had challenged his authority and, in doing so, had challenged the God who had appointed him. There was no triumph in his expression, no satisfaction at seeing his enemies isolated and exposed. Instead, there was sadness, the deep grief that comes from watching people you care about choose destruction over life. Because that's what this was really about. Not Moses versus Korah, not Aaron versus ambitious Levites, but life versus death, submission versus rebellion, God's way versus human wisdom. The choice had always been there, but now it was being revealed in its starkest terms. And then, just as Moses had finished speaking, just as the last person had moved to safety, just as the morning sun reached its full strength over the wilderness camp, something began to happen that defied every law of nature, every assumption about how the world works, every expectation of what was possible. The ground beneath Korah's feet began to tremble. It started as just a vibration, so subtle that at first only those standing closest could feel it. But it grew stronger, more pronounced, spreading outward from the area around the rebel leaders like ripples on a pond. The earth itself was responding to divine command, preparing to demonstrate that the God who had created it could also reshape it according to his will. People in the crowd began to point and whisper, their voices rising in alarm as they felt the tremors beneath their own feet. This wasn't just affecting the rebels anymore. This was something that threatened everyone, something that reminded them all of how small and fragile they were in the face of divine power. But the shaking was just the beginning. What happened next would burn itself into the memory of every person who witnessed it, a sight so unprecedented, so impossible by natural standards, that it would be told and retold for generations to come. The earth began to crack, not the small fissures you might see during a drought, or the minor splits that sometimes appear after heavy rains. These were massive crevices opening in the ground, spreading outward from directly beneath the feet of the rebel leaders, like a spiderweb of destruction. The sound was indescribable, a groaning and splitting that seemed to come from the very foundations of the world. And then, in a moment that seemed to stretch on forever, while lasting only seconds, the impossible became reality. The ground opened its mouth like some enormous beast awakening from sleep, creating a chasm so deep and so wide that no one could see the bottom. Korah stood on the edge of eternity, looking down into an abyss that had been created specifically for him and his rebellion. This wasn't coincidence or natural disaster. This was divine judgment made visible. God's response to those who had dared to challenge his appointed authority. For just an instant, time seemed suspended. Korah had one final moment to see the consequences of his choices, to understand what his pride and ambition had purchased for him. One last opportunity to comprehend that he hadn't been fighting against human leaders, but against the God of heaven and earth. And then the earth completed its terrible work. Korah fell first, his censer still clutched in his hand as he plunged into the darkness that had opened beneath his feet. Dathan and Abiram followed, their defiant expressions frozen in shock and terror as they realized that their rebellion had led them not to victory, but to destruction. But it wasn't just the leaders who fell. Their families went with them, their tents and possessions. Everything that belonged to them was swallowed by the hungry earth. In a matter of seconds, an entire community of rebels disappeared from sight, consumed by judgment that was as swift as it was complete. The ground closed over them like water closing over a stone dropped into a deep pool. The cracks sealed themselves, the trembling stopped, and the earth became solid once again. But something had changed forever. The place where Korah and his followers had stood was now marked by disturbed soil and the lingering memory of divine judgment. The crowd stood in stunned silence, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Children clung to their parents, strong men found themselves trembling, and even the most skeptical were forced to confront the reality of divine power that could reshape the world in an instant. This wasn't mythology or legend. This was history unfolding before their eyes. This was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, demonstrating that his patience has limits, that his mercy has boundaries, that there comes a point where rebellion meets justice and judgment falls like lightning from heaven. But the demonstration wasn't over yet. The earth had spoken, but heaven still had more to say. As the dust settled and the earth became still once more, the 250 men who had joined Korah's rebellion stood frozen in terror, their censers still clutched in trembling hands. They had watched their leader and his closest allies swallowed alive by the ground itself, but somehow they remained standing. Somehow they had been spared from that immediate judgment. Perhaps they thought the worst was over. Perhaps they believed that witnessing such horror would be enough, that God's point had been made and mercy would now prevail. Perhaps they convinced themselves that they were different from Korah, that their participation in the rebellion hadn't been as serious, as intentional, as worthy of divine wrath. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The silence that followed the earth's closing was broken by something far more terrifying than the groaning of splitting ground. From the tabernacle itself, from the very dwelling place of the Almighty, came a sound that made every person in the camp fall to their faces in terror. Fire erupted from the presence of the Lord, not the warm, comforting fire of a hearth or the dancing flames of a celebration torch. This was consuming fire, holy fire, the kind of fire that had spoken to Moses from the burning bush and had descended upon Mount Sinai with such power that the people begged Moses not to let God speak to them directly anymore. The flames shot out from the tabernacle like arrows of judgment, moving with supernatural speed and precision toward the 250 men who still stood with their censers raised. There was no time to run, no opportunity to drop their offerings and beg for mercy, no chance to distance themselves from their rebellion. In an instant that seemed to stretch across eternity, divine fire struck each man exactly where he stood. The flames didn't spread randomly or consume everything in their path like natural fire would. These were targeted, controlled, purposeful flames that found their mark with the accuracy that only comes from omniscient judgment. One by one, the rebels were consumed. Their censers, those sacred vessels they had presumed to use in challenging God's appointed priests, became instruments of their own destruction. The very incense they had offered in defiance became the fuel for their judgment. The smell of burning flesh mixed with the smoke of incense created an atmosphere of terror that no one present would ever forget. This wasn't warfare between human armies. This wasn't plague or famine or any kind of natural disaster. This was the direct intervention of a holy God who would not tolerate challenges to his authority. The speed of it was shocking. In the time it takes to draw a breath, 250 men who had been alive, breathing, plotting, and scheming were reduced to ash and memory. Their rebellion, which had seemed so reasonable just moments before, now lay exposed as the deadly poison it had always been. But even as the flames consumed the rebels, even as divine judgment fell with terrifying swiftness, something remarkable happened that revealed the heart of God in the midst of his wrath. The fire touched only those who had participated in the rebellion. The crowd that had moved away at Moses' warning remained untouched, protected by their obedience to the prophet's words. This wasn't indiscriminate destruction or divine fury run wild. This was precise judgment, carefully measured and exactly targeted. God's wrath had found its mark without harming a single innocent person, demonstrating that even in judgment, his justice remains perfect and his mercy continues to operate. The entire nation of Israel now lay prostrate on the ground, their faces pressed into the dust, their hearts hammering with terror and awe. They had witnessed something that shattered every assumption they might have had about the nature of divine authority and the consequences of challenging it. Children who had been old enough to understand what they were seeing would carry this memory for the rest of their lives. Parents found themselves struggling to explain to younger children how the ground could open up and swallow people, how fire could come from heaven to consume rebels, how the God they worshipped could be both merciful and terrible at the same time. But the lesson being taught wasn't just about individual consequences for individual rebellion. This was about the nature of divine order itself, about why God establishes authority structures, and what happens when those structures are challenged not in humility, but in pride. Moses stood in the aftermath of judgment, his heart heavy with the weight of what had just occurred. There was no celebration in his spirit, no sense of vindication or triumph over his enemies. Instead, there was the deep sadness that comes from watching people choose destruction when life was freely available to them. Aaron stood beside him, the high priest whose authority had been challenged, whose position had been coveted, whose calling had been questioned. The sacred garments he wore seemed heavier now, weighted with the responsibility of representing a holy God before a people who had just witnessed what happens when that holiness is treated with contempt. The bronze censers that had belonged to the consumed rebels lay scattered across the ground, silent witnesses to the price of presumption. These vessels, which had been crafted for sacred use, had become instruments of judgment when wielded by unauthorized hands. They gleamed in the morning sun like fallen stars, beautiful and deadly reminders of how quickly blessing can turn to cursing when pride enters the heart. God spoke to Moses in the aftermath, his voice carrying both authority and instruction. The censers were to be gathered and hammered into plates to overlay the altar, creating a permanent memorial of what had happened. Every time future generations came to offer sacrifices, they would see those bronze plates and remember the cost of challenging divine authority. It was a brilliant stroke of divine wisdom. The very instruments that had been used in rebellion would become part of the altar where proper worship took place. The metal that had been in the hands of those who presumed to improve on God's design would now serve as a reminder that God's ways are perfect and his appointments are not subject to human revision. As the bronze was being gathered and the memorial prepared, Something else was happening in the hearts and minds of the people who had witnessed these events. The shock was beginning to give way to understanding. The terror was being replaced by a deeper appreciation for the mercy they had already experienced. They began to realize how close they had all come to destruction. If they had listened to Korah's arguments, if they had joined his rebellion, if they had allowed his criticism of Moses and Aaron to poison their own hearts, they could have been among those consumed by fire or swallowed by the earth. The very complaints they might have harbored about their leaders now seemed petty and foolish in light of what they had seen. The dissatisfaction some had felt with their roles and positions in the community was overwhelmed by gratitude for simply being alive and in right relationship with the God who could command the elements themselves. But human nature is remarkably resilient in its capacity for self-deception. Even after witnessing such dramatic displays of divine power and judgment, the people of Israel would struggle to learn the lessons being taught. The memory of what happened to Korah would fade, the fear would diminish, and new forms of rebellion would emerge. Yet the story itself would endure, passed down from generation to generation as a warning and a promise. A warning that God's authority is not negotiable, that his appointed leaders are under his protection, that rebellion against divine order carries consequences beyond human imagination, and a promise that those who submit to God's design, who accept his structure for leadership and worship, who humble themselves under his mighty hand, will find safety and blessing even in the midst of judgment. The bronze plates on the altar would catch the light of sacrificial fires for centuries to come, reflecting not just the flames of worship, but the memory of divine fire that had consumed those who dared to challenge the Holy One of Israel. Future priests would see those plates and remember that their calling was not just an honor, but a responsibility, not just a privilege, but a sacred trust that must never be treated lightly. Future generations would hear the story and understand that proximity to holy things does not guarantee safety if the heart harbors rebellion. That access to God's presence is a gift, not a right. That serving in sacred roles requires humility, not ambition. That the God who calls and appoints is also the God who judges and removes. The wilderness had become a classroom where the most important lessons were written not in books, but in blood and fire, not in words, but in the transformed earth itself. Every step the Israelites took as they continued their journey would remind them of what they had seen. Every night as they made camp would bring back memories of the morning when heaven and earth had conspired to demonstrate divine justice. And in that demonstration, something profound had been revealed about the character of the God they served. He was not indifferent to challenges against his authority. He was not neutral when his appointed leaders were attacked. He was not passive when his design for order and structure was rejected in favor of human wisdom and democratic ideals. But neither was he cruel or arbitrary in his judgments. He had given warning, provided opportunity for repentance, offered escape to all who would accept it. His wrath, when it finally fell, was precise and purposeful, targeting only those who had chosen rebellion over submission, pride over humility, their own way over his perfect will. The story of Korah had become more than just an account of ancient rebellion. It had become a mirror in which every future generation could see their own hearts, their own tendencies toward pride and presumption, their own need for the humility that keeps them safe under the shadow of divine authority. As the sun climbed higher over the wilderness camp, and the immediate shock of what had occurred began to settle into long-term memory, the people of Israel found themselves changed by what they had witnessed. Some were changed by fear, others by gratitude, still others by a deeper understanding of the God they claimed to follow. But all of them had been confronted with a truth that would echo through Scripture and down through the ages. The God who creates can also destroy. The God who blesses can also judge. And the God who establishes authority will defend it against all who would challenge it in pride and presumption. The earth had opened and closed. The fire had consumed and been quenched, but the lesson remained. Divine authority is not subject to human approval. God's appointments do not require popular validation, and those who challenge heaven's design do so at their own eternal peril. Yet even as the bronze censers were being gathered and hammered into memorial plates, even as the disturbed earth settled back into its normal appearance, something unexpected began stirring in the hearts of the people. You might think that after witnessing such overwhelming displays of divine judgment, the entire nation would fall into permanent reverence and submission. You might assume that seeing rebels swallowed alive and consumed by holy fire would cure Israel of any tendency toward complaint or criticism forever. But human nature has a remarkable capacity for rationalization, for rewriting history in ways that make us feel better about our own hearts and choices. Within hours of the most dramatic demonstration of divine authority in their collective memory, whispers began circulating through the camp that would soon grow into something far more dangerous than Korah's original rebellion. The whispers started innocently enough, as they always do. Families gathering around their evening meals, trying to process what they had witnessed, struggling to make sense of events that defied human understanding. Children asking questions that parents found difficult to answer. Elderly people sharing memories of other times when they had seen God's power displayed in ways that shook their faith rather than strengthening it. But gradually, subtly, those whispers began to take on a different tone. Instead of awe at divine justice, some began expressing sympathy for the rebels. Instead of gratitude for being spared, some started questioning whether the punishment had been too severe. Instead of examining their own hearts for traces of the same pride that had destroyed Korah, some began to focus on Moses and Aaron as the real problem. It's fascinating how the human mind works when confronted with uncomfortable truth. Rather than accepting that Korah and his followers had been guilty of rebellion against God himself, it became easier to believe that they had been victims of Moses' political maneuvering. Rather than acknowledging that divine judgment had fallen on those who deserved it, it felt better to imagine that innocent people had died because of leadership conflicts. The rewriting of history began almost immediately. Korah, who had challenged the very foundations of divine order, began to be remembered as a reformer who had simply wanted fairness and inclusion. The 250 men who had presumed to offer incense without authorization began to be portrayed as sincere seekers who had been destroyed for asking legitimate questions. By the next morning, what had started as whispered concerns had crystallized into open accusations. A delegation of leaders approached Moses and Aaron, their faces set with a kind of righteous indignation that comes from believing you're defending innocent victims against corrupt authority. "You have killed the Lord's people," they declared, their voices carrying across the camp for all to hear. Can you imagine the audacity of that statement? These were people who had witnessed the earth opening by divine command, who had seen fire come directly from God's presence to consume rebels, who had heard Moses warn everyone to move away from the tents of the condemned. Yet somehow they had convinced themselves that Moses and Aaron were responsible for what had happened. This wasn't just historical revisionism, this was spiritual blindness of the most dangerous kind. It revealed hearts that were so committed to their own understanding, so invested in their own version of events, that they could watch God himself demonstrate his will and still find ways to blame human leaders for the consequences. Moses and Aaron stood before this new wave of accusation with hearts that must have been breaking. They had spent decades leading these people, sacrificing their own comfort and safety for the sake of the nation, interceding before God when judgment threatened to fall. And now they were being blamed for the very judgments they had tried to prevent. But God was not silent in the face of this new rebellion. Just as he had responded to Korah's challenge, he would respond to this attempt to rewrite history and shift blame from the guilty to the innocent. The same divine authority that had opened the earth and sent consuming fire was about to manifest itself again. And this time, the entire nation would be at risk. The glory of the Lord appeared suddenly over the tabernacle. that awesome manifestation of divine presence that had guided them through the wilderness and had spoken to Moses on Mount Sinai. But this time there was something different about it, something that made even Moses and Aaron fall on their faces in terror. This wasn't the glory that had appeared to give guidance or instruction. This wasn't the cloud that had led them by day, or the fire that had protected them by night. This was the glory of divine wrath, the visible manifestation of a holy God who had reached the limit of his patience with a rebellious and stiff-necked people. God spoke to Moses with words that sent chills through every fiber of his being. "Get away from this assembly so I can put an end to them at once." The threat was immediate and absolute. Not just the leaders who had made accusations, not just those who had participated in rewriting history, but the entire congregation was now under divine judgment. The same mercy that had protected them during Korah's rebellion was being withdrawn because they had failed to learn the lessons that judgment was meant to teach. Moses understood exactly what this meant. He had seen God's wrath before, had witnessed what happened when divine patience was exhausted. The entire nation of Israel, hundreds of thousands of people, were moments away from destruction. All of God's promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob hung in the balance. The future of redemption itself was at stake. But this is where we see the heart of true spiritual leadership revealed in its purest form. Instead of stepping back and allowing judgment to fall, instead of protecting himself and his family while letting the people face the consequences of their choices, Moses threw himself prostrate before the Lord and began to intercede with an intensity that came from the very depths of his soul. Aaron joined him immediately. The high priest and the prophet united in desperate prayer for a people who had just accused them of murder. There was no time for hurt feelings or wounded pride, no opportunity to point out the injustice of being blamed for God's own actions. This was a moment for intercession, for standing in the gap between divine wrath and human rebellion. "Take your censer," Moses commanded Aaron, his words coming in urgent gasps as he felt the weight of impending judgment. "Put incense in it along with fire from the altar, and hurry to the assembly to make atonement for them. Wrath has come out from the Lord. The plague has started." Aaron grabbed his censer and ran toward the crowd with a desperation that came from understanding exactly what was at stake. This wasn't a ceremonial procession or a planned worship service. This was a race against divine judgment, an attempt to intercede before wrath could complete its work. But even as Aaron ran, the plague that Moses had warned about was already beginning to manifest. People at the edges of the crowd began to collapse, struck down by an invisible force that moved through the assembly, like wind through wheat. The judgment wasn't coming as dramatically as the opening earth or consuming fire, but it was just as deadly and far more widespread. Panic erupted throughout the camp as people realized what was happening. Those who had been complaining about Moses and Aaron just moments before now found themselves crying out for the very leaders they had been attacking. The accusations of murder that had seemed so reasonable in the morning now sounded like blasphemy as divine wrath began to fall on the accusers themselves. Aaron reached the outer edge of the crowd and began moving through the assembly, swinging his censer and offering incense with an urgency that communicated far more than words ever could. This wasn't ritual or ceremony. This was warfare in the spiritual realm, a battle between intercession and judgment that would determine the fate of an entire nation. Behind him, people continued to fall as the plague spread through the camp. But wherever Aaron went, wherever the smoke of his incense rose, the plague stopped its advance. He was literally standing between the living and the dead, using the very priestly authority that had been challenged and questioned to save the lives of those who had questioned it. Picture that scene if you can. Aaron, the high priest whose position had been coveted by Korah and his followers, now running through the crowd with his life-giving incense, desperately trying to save people who had just accused him of murder. Moses, the leader who had been blamed for God's judgment, prostrate before the tabernacle pleading for mercy on behalf of those who had slandered his character. This is what true spiritual authority looks like when it's tested by crisis. Not self-protection or vindication or the desire to prove a point, but sacrificial love that puts the welfare of others above personal vindication. Not withdrawal in the face of false accusations, but deeper engagement in intercession and service. Aaron moved through the crowd like a man possessed, stopping the plague wherever he went, creating a barrier of intercession between divine wrath and human rebellion. The incense from his censer rose like prayers made visible, carrying the aroma of atonement into the presence of a holy God whose justice had been provoked, but whose mercy could still be appealed to through proper channels. Gradually, slowly, the plague began.